Well, would you believe we need one more session on this sixth commandment because it's so big. We've got, we know you shall not murder, but we've already been introduced to the fact that at the other end of the spectrum, Jesus said even if you're angry, it's part of breaking the sixth commandment. So that means there's a whole big spectrum in between of ways that we could break this sixth commandment that leads up to finally, you shall not murder. And that means any sort of violence or any sort of anything from anger all the way up to actually killing someone. And the further application, therefore, of this sixth commandment is any time we're doing anything that deliberately causes harm to someone else's physical body or ourselves. We've already looked at suicide as breaking this commandment. But that means we should seek to avoid any kind of self-harm, mutilating our body or deliberately defacing or damaging the body other than for medical reasons, abusing alcohol or drugs or cigarettes or any of those things. And actually some of those can be the hardest. Alcohol and cigarettes can actually be the hardest to give up. And we need to remember if you someone who struggles with any kind of addiction, that God is looking at the heart. Is your heart repentant? Not how well you're doing in this effort, in this struggle, but He looks at the heart. Do you hate that sin? Do you want to put it to death? And therefore, that means it could be a process that God might take you through. The repentant heart, even when we're struggling, even when we're not winning, we'll want to try, we'll want to get back up and keep fighting against any kind of addiction. Not to mention it also falls under this second commandment, idolatry, but also in this commandment, if it's damaging the body. But that's also a call to the rest of us to, rather than being judgmental when someone is struggling with something, to get alongside them and be an encouragement and be a prayer warrior in the journey with those people rather than making it harder for them by looking down on them. We've got to support each other in this process. And children, are you listening to me? Because this is a good time to take seriously this commandment. You'll know that it's wrong to harm yourself, but sometimes, somewhere, someone's going to come up to you and say, they're going to offer you cigarettes or drugs or alcohol before you're of age and so on. And you know that's wrong, but now you know why. It's wrong because it's breaking the sixth commandment to deliberately do harm to your body. So that's the big picture of the commandment, is you shall not murder. Where does war fit in then? Where does war fit in? Remember, the Hebrew word used in this commandment, you shall not murder, is not any killing. It is the intentional, illegal taking of another human life. You shall not murder. But the Bible teaches there is such a thing as just self-defense. There's certainly even a moral responsibility to prevent national aggression and combat and all that sort of stuff. Why? To seek to prevent the breaking of this commandment, the further breaking of this sixth commandment. Now, certainly in a fallen world, the lines get pretty confused and blurred. What is a just war? And I'm not going to try and answer all that because I don't know all of the answers to that. All I'm trying to lay down is a principle that is in the Bible, that in a fallen world, there are times where just war has to occur for the very reason of the prevention of breaking this commandment, you shall not murder, to stop killing, to protect citizens. It's the same reason why we need police. How come everybody just doesn't do the right thing? What do we need police for? Well, the Christian worldview is you're always going to need police because we're all sinners and there will always be people seeking to go outside the law. But our Christian worldview accepts that. We need police. We need police to be armed. The police officer who killed one of those terrorists in Bondi, was he committing murder? Of course not. He was seeking to prevent further killing. And so the police should be armed. Hitler was out to murder many more millions of people if there had not been intervention of military warfare against him. And yes, all kinds of civilians and innocent people get killed, and that's the ugliness of war. And yet, that is exactly what needed to happen to prevent more killing. We would love it if there was no more need for wars. No more wars, that'd be great. But Jesus warned us. See, we've got a different worldview than the world out there. Why don't you just stop all the wars? Jesus told it ain't going to stop. There will be wars and rumours of wars all the way up to the end. That's the state of this world, and we need to navigate the best way, the most biblical way through that. And the book of Deuteronomy, as we've been looking at, expands the 10 Commandments and has specific requirements for a just war. That even in a fallen world there is a requirement for self-defense. Jesus wasn't against self-defense. He told his disciples when he sent them out, the second time when he sent them out, he said, make sure you take a sword with you. And then Peter rocks up with 2 and he goes, that's enough. And then later he has to rebuke Peter for using that sword in a combative, aggressive way. There's a place for it though, said Jesus. I want you to take a sword. I want you to defend yourself. Jesus commended the faith of the army captain, the centurion. Remember that guy? Now this is an actual problem for the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are extreme pacifists. Say no one should ever be in the army and all that sort of stuff. Well, they don't look too closely at this, because Jesus did not say to that army captain, you have more faith than anyone else in Israel as long as you repent of being in the army. He didn't say that. And he commends him, even in the role he had. And in fact, if you look through the scriptures in the New Testament, how many times centurions, that's an army captain over 100 soldiers, how many times they are commended? That one was commended by Jesus having more faith than anyone in Israel. But then there was the centurion who was there at the very cross of Jesus. Jesus died on the cross, and that centurion declared, this truly is the Son of God. Then in Acts 10, we had Cornelius. He was a centurion, the first Gentile convert on the way to the ends of the earth. He was a centurion, commended for his faith. Never once told, well, now you're a Christian, you better drop your army career. John the Baptist did the same thing. Remember when John the Baptist was actually instructing different peoples how to live a godly life, and the soldiers said to him, how then should we live? And he went on and told them how to live, but he didn't say, and by the way, you should leave the army. No, in other words, there is a place for it in a biblical worldview, for police, for war where it's necessary. But what about the wars commanded in the Old Testament, where some of them are deliberate acts of aggression that are commanded by God himself? How do we explain that? In fact, unbelievers and biblical skeptics jump on this one. Richard Dawkins said, God breaks his own rules. He commands war. You shall not murder, but he commands war. And they jump on this as this great example of, quote, genocide. God, for instance, the big one that's used is when Joshua's commanded to go and kill all the Canaanites so Israel can take the land. See, there's an example of genocide. Just wipe out those peoples just because God wants his people to have that land. Well, is that all there is to it? Life is cheap. What do you say when people say that? And people will say that to you. What about those wars in the Old Testament? Well, life is not cheap in God's sight. In fact, it's because of the preciousness of life and the grievousness of breaking that sixth commandment, you shall not murder, that God actually commands these wars, among other reasons. Have a look at the description of the motive, God's motive for driving out the Canaanites far from genocide in Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 4. After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of what? The wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It's the wickedness of the nations. Same principle, just one more example. Leviticus 20 verse 23. You must not live according to the customs of the nations I am going to drive out before you. Because they did all these things, I abhorred them. Why did he abhor them? What wickedness? Well, we touched on this earlier in this commandment, but we're going to look at it more deeply now. In the Old Testament, there are listed many sins as to what motivated God to say, go in and wipe out those Canaanites. And he lists the sins, several places. But it seems on top of the list is child sacrifice. People killing their own children. Look at Deuteronomy verse 18, chapter 18, verse 9. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to imitate the detestable things of those nations. There shall not be found among you, first on the list, anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire. That's killing your own child. Because of these detestable things, the Lord your God will drive them out before you. Because of these things, God will drive them out before you. That's the reason God tells Israel, go in and wipe out those Canaanites and take that land. It's an issue of justice. Remember the severity of God's justice and breaking this commandment, especially the killing of children. So God doesn't just indiscriminately say, like Richard Dawkins would have it, hey, you got to go in there and wipe out those Amorites and the Canaanites because I'm going to give that land to you. Like as though he picks on a nation and says, get rid of them. Far from it. Far from being genocide, because it wasn't even the Canaanites, Amorites in general in history that God said to wipe out. He did the opposite. He said for 400 years, don't go in and kill those Canaanites. Why? Because their sin, including child sacrifice, had not yet reached the full measure. It took 400 years before God said, now, go in and take those people out and take that land. When they'd reached that full measure of sin. Have a look at Genesis chapter 15 verse 16, where 400 years earlier, Abraham was told, you're not going to have that land for 400 years. Why? Look at it with me. Genesis 15 verse 16. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites, that's one of the Canaanite nations, the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Their sin including child sacrifice, had not yet come to that point until this time, when 400 years later God said go in, and God described it as the land will vomit them out. It's a strong term meaning God's repulsed by the acts such as child sacrifice, and brings justice against those who are breaking this sixth commandment. And when Israel followed the same practices, when they did actually do it, what happened? God did the same thing to them. Israel were carrying on with the same kind of sin, and God brought the Assyrians in to wipe them out and take them out of their land. Judah was doing the same thing. God brought in Babylon. 100 years after Israel, Judah gets taken out by the Babylonians. And what was the last straw that caused God to say, no, you've had every opportunity? It was the king of Judah, Manasseh, who was doing what? Sacrificing his own child. And that's when God says, too late. You're getting shipped out too and destroyed. Though he saved a remnant because of his grace. Well, what was God doing, calling on all these wars? Preventing the breaking of the sixth commandment. You shall not murder. A just war. A just war. Now, there have been some critics who've turned around and said, well, God commits child sacrifice, he gives up his son. Very clever, very clever. But it ain't going to work for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is not child sacrifice. When the Son, the eternal Son, was in on the plan every bit, and it was his plan, he's God who made the plan as much as the Father. And so, number one, it was unlike child sacrifice, where the child has no say in it. But secondly, God giving up his son for us was for the saving of life. It wasn't about killing, it was about saving life. So why then, in some instances, does God demand the destruction of men, women, and children? You'll see it in the Old Testament. Well, here we're actually dependent on the sovereign knowledge of God. And one example that really brings this home is when King Saul was commanded to wipe out the Amalekites, men, women, and children. And Saul disobeyed. He thought he was more compassionate than God. We'll just take the goodies and we'll keep some of the women and children or whatever, and as it turns out, God rebukes Saul. It's a major turning point in Saul's kingship. And Samuel has to step in, and the king of the Amalekites, King Agag, Samuel pronounces judgment on him, something that Saul refused to do, and he has him executed. Why? Back to the same reason. Child sacrifice. Read with me in 1 Samuel 15 verse 33. He says to King Agag, as your sword made women childless, so will your mother be childless. In other words, you're a child murderer and it's going to cost you your life for doing that. But why did Saul have to destroy men, women and children? Why not just wipe out King Agag and that's it? Well, we can't always see what God's sovereign plan is in his commands to initiate war in the Old Testament. But the ones we do see, where he does explain the plan, allow us to be able to have the trust that there's always a reason. And in this case, there was a reason. And we looked at this in our series, those of you who are with us in this series on Esther, where you had Haman, the prime minister, the evil Haman, whose plan was to commit genocide upon and wipe out, literal genocide. I mean, really wanting to wipe out every single person, a Jewish person on the face of the earth. And he offered the money to the king and got the edict from the king. And so it's all set to go to wipe out all the Jews. And who was this Haman who was going to murder every Jew on the face of the earth? Who was Haman? Well, let's look at Esther chapter 3 verse 10. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So he gives him the authority to kill all the Jews. But did you notice who he is? Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. Who is Haman? He is a descendant of the very people, men, women, and children. He was a descendant of those children that Saul was told to wipe out. And the Amalekites continued on, became great enemies of Israel, seeking to kill them off all the way through to culminating in that story in Esther, where Haman, the descendant of those people that Saul didn't kill, was going to kill every single Jew off the face of the earth. In other words, God knew why he had told Saul to kill them, men, women, and children. He knew who those children would grow up to be. He knew not only the future, but the potential future, and commanded thus way. See, we think we're more compassionate than God, saying, God's so harsh in his judgments. But in fact, we're demeaning the sixth commandment in human life and how seriously God takes it. He wants to prevent people who want to murder others, whether it's in child sacrifice or any life made in the image of God. It's serious in God's sight. We think, now, the God in the Old Testament, he's the harsh God, and the New Testament's much less harsh. Because in the Old Testament, you've got, capital punishment for breaking the sixth commandment. But it's actually the same for most of the commandments, capital punishment. And we go, oh, that's really harsh. You've got execution for idolatry, execution for taking the Lord's name in vain, execution for breaking the Sabbath, execution. Have a look at this one, children. Exodus chapter 21 verse 15. Anyone who attacks his father or mother must be put to death. Anyone who curses his father and mother must be put to death. Honor your father and mother or you get the death penalty. Wow. How serious is that? How many children will we have left if we enforce this all the time? That they'd all be here except for one from each family, because once the first one got it, you'd pull into line. But now, look, this is how serious how grieved he is at breaking his commandments. But how do we reconcile such harsh penalties? How can we ever imagine a loving God having such harsh penalties? And in the Old Testament, and as we say, it's so harsh in the Old Testament. But the New Testament tells us in a couple of places, Romans 15:4, 1 Corinthians 10:11, tells us that the reason those things are written down, all the history is unfolded with all its harshness, it's there to teach us. It was actually written down for us. So we can read that Old Testament and understand how serious God is about breaking his law. We can see the immediate punishment. People, wars and people getting killed. But as I've said before, we don't actually know whether all those people who get struck down for discipline, like Uzzah for touching the ark, whether he may have been a believer. But that's the penalty. Don't do it. It's written down like that for us to see how serious God is about it. We say the Old Testament judgments are so much more harsh than the New Testament. But in actual fact, that's not true. Not even close. I'd much rather, if I was an unbeliever, I'd much rather have an Old Testament judgment than the New Testament judgments. You know, in the Old Testament you get cut down, death, you leave this world, that's it. The judgments in the New Testament are far more severe and far more lasting. And Jesus, the most loving man who ever walked the face of the earth, tried to tell us. He spoke about hell more than anyone. He spoke about the severity of the being cut off forever. That this is how serious God is about sin. This is how loving God is. He warned us. He warned us. He didn't just leave us to find out at the end. He warned us. Because in fact, the Old Testament penalties are far less severe. Here's the death penalty in the New Testament, Revelation 14:10. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There'll be no rest day or night. So physically dying from this earth is not all there is to death. What the New Testament describes as the second death, you don't just go to sleep. And people will tell you, I think when you die, you just go to sleep. Nothing. Just worms eating you. Ha ha. You really going to bet your eternal destiny on that? Have you ever been to the other side and come back to know what's on the other side, to bet your whole eternal destiny on that? And then they're going to say to you, well, have you ever been to the other side? And you go, no, I don't, but I know someone who has and come back. And he told us there's a real heaven, there's a real hell, and we've got to get it right this side before we die. The death penalty is there in the New Testament, as clear as ever, but in far greater fullness. I hope and pray none of us will experience the second death, because God hasn't lowered his standards. In the Old Testament, the penalty, as I said before, for most of the Ten Commandments is death. His standards haven't lowered. The death penalty is the same in the New Testament. How could we miss it? The cross of Christ. That's Jesus taking the death penalty for all who will repent and believe in him. The punishment is just as severe. It's taken upon Jesus instead of you, if you will but believe. That opens up a whole lot of thought about what Jesus actually did on that cross for us, doesn't it? You see, we think, well, Jesus died on the cross for our sins. That's wonderful. Yes, good. Hey, hundreds of thousands of people died on crosses in the ancient world. Torturous, horrible deaths. And Jesus was particularly torturous and horrible in that sense, but that's not even coming close to what was going on at the cross. Have you done the mathematics? Have you thought it out? If Jesus is paying our eternal hell, that is, the smoke of their torment rises forever and ever, he must have been experiencing that upon the cross, as only the eternal Son of God could, taking the eternal wrath from the Father. Jesus had to be experiencing that shutting off, that eternal shutting off. Why have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus had to experience, or He didn't pay the price for us. The only way he could pay it is to experience all of what we would have experienced, what we deserve to experience. He took. How much love is this? How much love is this? That he took your eternal hell. And what does he want you to do? Measure up, Lucia and Terry made their vows. Are they going to be perfect now? No. Because they're not putting their trust in what they do, but on what Jesus has done to take away their sin. Jesus took the second death. God's justice against our sin. The death penalty has been paid. Today's the day to commit your life to Jesus.